Food hacks, supplements, fad diets, nootropics. In the expansive landscape of online marketing campaigns, social media, and algorithms, it feels like half of all you read or hear online boasts some form of post-human biological optimization. These products promise a gambit of health benefits and biological improvements to the human body. Some claim to help your brain function at a faster speed or capacity. Some claim to regulate your gut to make your input and output as efficient as a hybrid automobile. In all of this, there's a common appeal to self-betterment. A tug at the universal belief that we could be smarter, stronger, less anxious, with just a little help from technological innovation. But these products and their claims have dipped into the realm of the uncanny. In the promises they offer, there's a darkness lying below the surface, a sense of existential dread and mortal panic. Dr. Jeremy Tirrell has been examining this phenomenon. In his upcoming book, which is tentatively titled Strange Consumptions, the Gothic Rhetorics of Nutrition, he and Dr. Kate Maddalena look at the relationship between humanity's nutritional discourse and the weird, eerie rhetoric that surrounds it. By utilizing a Gothic lens, they hope to illustrate how these adverts prey on our discomforts and anxieties, working to make us desperate for scientific intervention. From Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington, you're listening to the Relevate podcast. I'm your host, Daniel Charles Wright. Let's begin, shall we? Dr. Tirrell, thank you for coming on the show.
Yeah, of course.
To start out, tell me a little bit about how you started looking into contemporary consumption rhetoric. What sparked your interest in the language of nutritional discourse?
Yeah, that's a great question. If I could trace it back to a single event, it would be an ad I got through some social media channel that was for the meal replacement beverage Soylent, which is still available today. And the sort of slug of the ad was, we've mapped the food genome, which, this was just a disposable ad, one of a million. But, I momentarily kind of paused on and thought, well, on the face of it, that's absurd. You can't map the genome of the concept of food. But, it's just sort of the way that the language was being used. Sometimes this is called science exploitation, where it's sort of leveraging, I've heard of genome mapping. I assume that's positive. And then, of course, the product itself, Soylent, which was explicitly leaning into Soylent Green, the, cult film. But it was just interesting to me that there was this product that was like, let's explicitly lean into the ghoulishness of eating corpses and the way it's being presented as this kind of science solution. So that was the genesis of the project. I started with that work, that chapter, and then it really grew from there into the other areas you mentioned.
Interesting. What led you to apply a Gothic framework for your research? How did you arrive at that conclusion?
In looking at these things, it was more than just like, well, that's odd. It's like, that's where we start, is the feeling. What makes it odd? And part of that was sort of literal use of the ghoul image, where it's quirky, but why? And it's like, well, but it's leveraging this sort of cultural thread we've had, which we place within the Gothic, this sort of like fascination with transformation and the sort of dark possibility of that, right? Which, to make yourself better, you kind of have to risk death, right? If we think conventionally about Gothic, which in the book we point out, many thinkers have said it's not just a literary genre, right? It's this sort of cultural aesthetic that manifests in different ways. And if we think about it, it's like, you can become immortal, but you have to sacrifice your humanity. Or, there's always this kind of trade-off or this risk. If you want something great, you have to pay some sort of price. And so the Gothic became just sort of this, in part because they were talking about, in Soylent's case, a ghoul in its partner Juicero, the sort of overpriced juicer, which is no longer a functional item. But, the language was vampiric. They're literally talking about, the life contained in this juice and how it's very different than solids. And it's like, it just sort of clicked that it's like they're playing on these tropes, in some cases explicitly, in some cases it's just this cultural feeling of this sort of supernatural achievement that's possible when you risk things in a very material way.
In your book, you describe a narrative of cultural anxiety around food and dietary choices, and how this is exacerbated by the dread associated with food deserts and food swamps. How do you see the rhetoric of the Gothic at play in these situations?
Yeah, so it's a big topic, so I'll try not to spiral, but it's, we can see in those, there's this notion of fear embedded in that, right? The swamp, the desert. It's not just that these are vacant landscapes or whatever. It's like they're dangerous ones. When you go there, you die, conceivably. And it's like, why is that our language? And part of this also, and this is a central sort of pillar of the book, is that it's very, particularly in a North American context, which was our purview. My co-author is at a Canadian institution, so we were able to at least look at a few different countries in North America. It's very individualistic, where it's like your life and your health are your fault, and you're always doing it wrong. So there's this notion of the desert or the food desert or the food swamp, where it's like, well, you're in a dangerous area. And part of this is like, it's your responsibility. It's always kind of being pressed on the individual, where we're being flooded with different messages in an area where we have so much information that it's hard to adjudicate things. But it's like, well, it's your fault. I mean, the truth is in there somewhere. You got to sift through. I mean, this is a strong message of the North American healthcare system, where, it gets sewed up with like, be your own advocate. It's like, I get that, but why? It's like, it really shouldn't necessarily be our individual job to make sense of competing messages in which there's little consensus. It's not like there's one true thing being diluted by BS. It's like, well, everything is kind of a level playing field just being shoveled at us. It's weird that it's like, well, it's your responsibility to sort it out. And anything bad that happens to you is pretty much your fault then, because, you had a choice. So it gets embedded in those notions of landscape. It's like, well, don't live in the food desert, man. It's like, well, it's not exactly an easy choice, But it is always coded in this language of fear and kind of almost supernatural mystique.
Yeah, sure. And in the Gothic, especially in Gothic horror, the notion of gaslighting is really big, and you see that at play as well. In your research and through looking at this, because you've been looking at this for a number of years now, did anything really surprise you?
I mean, just about everything in some ways, I guess, an academic surprise. One thing would be that how the individualism gets pressed in that way was kind of unusual. The fact that we were kind of leaning into these tropes. When Kate and I were writing the book, we just text each other. It's like, oh, here's another one. It's just sort of like, to call a product soylent is interesting. And this happens not only there, but how nootropics are named. There's a kind of explicit, overt messaging where it's not even being hidden. I mean, that's part of it. It's not like we're being lied to. It's like, no, we're being explicit with you about this. And it's not like we don't have choice, but there's a lot of different forms of persuasion going on there. And a lot of it's just sort of in your face. That was partially unexpected. It's just sort of, we'd get anxious about, like, every day it was, oh, here's another one of these. Here's another one of these. And it's just sort of pervasive and it's overt.
Yeah, that's why it's interesting that the othering of food consumption and renaming the products like Soylent, it's not like liquid food. It's like you can't even call it food anymore. It has to have some sort of marketable name.
Definitely. And that abstraction occurs both in that sort of positive, seemingly positive, but it also occurs, for example, in, if you know what a Nutriloaf is, which is a food substance that is given to incarcerated people, particularly those who are deemed as being behavioral problems. In fact, it has sort of a history of it's being challenged as unconstitutional. It's constituted as a cruel and unusual punishment, because the idea is it's just sort of a catch-all term for these are leftover items that have been processed into a food substance, a loaf, that is then given to inmates who, for example, can't be given utensils, right? Because it could be dangerous to them or others. And so there's this interesting sort of, and the way that it's spoken of is this kind of interesting abstracted way where law enforcement will talk about it, where it's like, it's not cruel. It gives them all their nutrients. We put it in them. Therefore, it's okay. It's like, okay, but That's also how we get things like people being given Ensure enemas in Guantanamo, where it's like someone's on a hunger strike. It's like, well, let's shoot it up their backside, and it's going in, and it has the appropriate numbers. Therefore, this works. It's interesting that it's abstracted in that ways, but it's also abstracted to, like Soylent is pitched to coders as efficiency. Don't waste time cooking and chewing. Suck this down while you're coding and just keep going.
It's a product of like hyper-capitalism with the intense emphasis on productivity that you don't even have time to eat anymore. You have to be productive.
Yeah, and so there's this bending together of what is the benefit of efficiency to coders is possibly a constitutional violation for inmates who not only have to do this, but it's like that's all they get. Whereas Soylent, it has an interesting kind of rhetorical move where it winks at, hey, don't replace all of your food, but I, the guy who invented it, I'm going to post a personal blog where I did exactly that. But hey, don't do it. Don't do it. But hey, I did it. And it's great. It has this interesting move. It is a very kind of capitalist thing, that notion of productivity. That's something, in fact, my co-author brought to it because she has a much more sophisticated feminist approach than I do. And so she was able to parse out how, particularly for males, products are focused on productivity. You've got to output more and more. For women, sometimes the exact same products are marketed as finding balance, where it's like, we're not going to point out that you're already overburdened because you know this, and we tend not to in North America articulate and value the jobs that women are doing. And so what we want to do is market things to you as relieve stress and find a balance. So it would be like, take a moment for yourself. So things like microdosing is being pushed to women as you can still do it all, but everything's going to be okay because you're going to have a little trip every day, right? The edge is just going to get sanded right off, or you're going to be able to just chill out, right? That becomes the command to women. Relax, which is just another command. To men, it's productivity. It's do it. And they're often the same products, but they take these different formats.
That's fascinating. That reminds me of just the history of marketing. You see these same trends and things all over. Like it's marketing 101 to have, if you're targeting men, it needs to make them feel like they're doing something that is like technologically or scientifically advanced. So you'll see like razors for men called things like the Mach 4 because it has that science connection. And then same thing on the women's side, like it makes me think of bath commercials from the 80s where like it's all about that women's escape, but really it is that like take a moment for yourself, but then get back to taking care of your kids and your house and your family, which is your responsibility.
Yeah, and ideally with something like microdosing, it's do them simultaneously, right? Yeah. Don't go sit in the bath.
Yeah, it's evolved.
Yes, it's, you know what? You can be in the bath in your mind while you're still on top of your 3 kids, you know?
That's wild. There's a book that I really like called Darkly, Black History and America's Gothic Soul. And in it, the author Leila Taylor explores the notion that American culture has an inevitable Gothicity in the traces left from chattel slavery. She posits that the persistence of white supremacy and the ubiquity of Black death feeds a national culture of terror and a perpetual undercurrent of mourning. Did you notice any of these trends in your market research as well?
Very much so. And this was one of the benefits of being able to like talk about this work with peers is some folks point out, they're like, well, how does this square with the Gothic itself has features that feed into this? I mean, the Gothic, a strong component of it is fear of another. And, you know, often that other is associated with, at times, a very specific like Orientalism, the othering of like Count Dracula. He comes from Wallachia, you know, he comes from this mysterious East, and no one cares that he's eating their peasants out there. The problem is he comes to London, and he comes here on the fibers of capitalism. He comes here because we reached too far with our global capitalism, touched something that we don't understand, and it's coming back on us, right? And so there's this definite othering in the Gothic. And other scholars like Franco Moretti have pointed out that the Gothic as a literary genre is inherently conservative, even though we associate it with the fantastic. The move is things are normal, things get weird, things go back to normal. Right? It doesn't ever really approach, but the normal is horrible for a lot of people, right? The quotidian is, for Black Americans, grinding them out. So the return to normalcy is no achievement here, right? And it suggests this is what we want, right? We just want to get back to how things ought to be. So yeah, definitely those things came up. And then specifically, and I brought just a bit from a chapter, because precisely that issue of when the body becomes a commodity, our nation has a suspect history with that. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's more than suspect. And not only in the form of our national sin of slavery, but one thing that came up for us is how things get commodified for both medical and commercial edible products. And so like something that came up for us was the HeLa cell line, the biological product that has been used for cancer research and was taken from a human being, Henrietta Lacks. And her family, was never compensated for this. They weren't even informed that this had happened until actually comparatively recently. So there's a piece from the book that kind of addresses this. And again, a lot of this came from conversations with peers who pointed out exactly these kinds of issues. Where how does this manifest in these particular ways? So we have an excerpt in our chapter that's looking at synthetic, it's called Impossible Flesh. It's looking at synthetic meat products. So not only things like the Impossible Burger, which is derived from plants, but also cultured cells. We're growing animal cells. It's not super economically viable right now, but it's on the cusp of it maybe. So this selection points out, it says, more fundamentally, these mingled medical and food science technologies resurrect questions about treating living body parts as property, palpable in, for example, the ethical discussions surrounding the HeLa cell line as it is addressed by texts including Rebecca Skloot's The Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. Here we overtly see parts of a black body being institutionally appropriated as subservient objects, something to be mass-produced and exploited. And although the HeLa cell line has been an unquestioned boon for global medical research, the resultant benefits have been unequally distributed along lines of race, class, and nationality. Moreover, the line's development is thoroughly problematic and steeped in a cultural history of black exploitation by the American medical institution. Theodora Danilovich ties this lineage specifically to consuming meat and beyond thinking black flesh as meat patties and the end of eating everything. Danilovich registers the Gothic discomfort of these works mingling of bodies and meat, noting, dehiscent black flesh communicates by the decentering of one's senses with the revulsion impulse, such that one feels its horror, evoking a visceral reaction of disgust and refusal. These issues simmer underneath so-called synthesized cells, and as Sarah Wasson states in A Butcher Shop Where the Meat Still Moved, the biotechnical benefits they offer inevitably inhabit a colonized binary flowing from east to west, from poor to wealthy, from female to male, from children to parents, and from the marginalized to powerful. So there are scholars that we were able to bring in who address these issues both in a particularly American context, growing out of slavery, but also in continued inequalities, particularly in the American medical establishment, where we can point to things like the Tuskegee syphilis study and other examples, but also how that meshes with a Gothic fear of an other, and also a particularly situated one where it was focused on a colonialist mindset. So even things like the cannibalistic references to long pig, which come up in this same chapter, that was used as a means primarily perhaps to turn other peoples into savages, right? These aren't humans, they're something else. Therefore, our abominable treatment of them is morally okay. So we see, turning them into like animals in certain ways, like, well, they call humans pigs. There's this conflation and differentiation and conflation based on our needs. In order to do what we want to do, they have to be subhuman. But now we need them to be human for particular reasons, and now they need to be subhuman again. It kind of oscillates back and forth historically.
There's a novel by Agustina Bazterrica called Tender is the Flesh. I don't know if you've heard of it, but it tackles a lot of these concepts in the world that Bazterrica creates for that novel. The poor have been removed of their human status, and they are considered cattle, and they have turned the meat processing industry into, they no longer care about cows and pigs and chickens. It processes the new form of cattle, which are the poor people. And she's definitely getting at capitalism and definitely taking digs at factory farming and factory meat agriculture. But as I was listening to you read that passage and reading some of the bit of your book that you sent me, it really reminded me of that novel, and thinking like they definitely echo each other.
Yeah. And we look at some different works of fiction. I mean, and right now, things like cannibalism is oddly salient. I mean, this isn't just cherry picking. If you look around at like Yellow Jackets and Raw and Fresh and Bones and All, everything with Hannibal Lecter in it, who has become this odd, it's like, why is this an attractive symbol? You know? It's become relevant in interesting ways, not only literal cannibalism, but then also, as we saw with something like Saltburn, where the director discusses it as not an eat the rich movie, but a taste and suck the rich. And it's like, there's this notion of not only literal, but metaphorical cannibalism that's become very relevant again.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I just watched Saltburn recently, and I thought the same thing. The way, I don't know, have you watched the film?
I haven't seen it yet.
But the way that the antagonist in that film portrays his treatment, and it's because it's like a very sensual cannibalistic heist. The way that he seduces every member of the family and then ultimately kills them. I totally agree. Coming to the end of this project, where you're facing publication, that usually means the death of the project. What are some of the biggest conclusions that your research has led you to?
This is a good question, because there is sort of like at the end of it, it's like, what do we do with this, right? And we didn't have sort of a clear call to action or anything. I mean, we're not even certain if that's warranted, if it's like, well, something needs to change. It was more, it helps us understand what's happening, but the ought there is a little gray. So I think one of the conclusions that we came to is this is relevant in a lot of areas of study. And as I said, we kept kind of finding more and more examples of, well, and this is related, and this is related, and things that didn't fall squarely on what we were doing. Because we kept finding other things, as like, we had to draw a circle of, well, do you put it in your mouth and swallow it? It's like pulling a sweater. There's lots of stuff here that's related, but...
Makes me think of Gwyneth Paltrow and the whole Goop movement.
Oh, that's in there.
Yeah. Because a lot of that you're not actually ingesting. You're using it as an IV, or you're putting it in your rectum.
Yes. Goop is in our introduction in part because there are political associations with this as well, and they're literally the same products that are marketed by Goop and by Alex Jones. But the language used, I believe it's called something male enhancement by Alex Jones, and it's called sex dust by Gwyneth Paltrow.
Because it's such wildly different demographics.
We would think, but part of the impetus of the book is it doesn't necessarily bend along clean political lines, because there's this sort of the attraction of the iconoclast, which crosses over them, and we start to see, in fact, what has been called the crunchy to alt-right pipeline. This notion, and we've started to see these stories of, well, I was going to yoga, and then all of a sudden my teacher started talking about Trump, and I was like, what? And our binaries don't fit this cleanly.
Yeah.
Even our binaries of truth and lies, we start in the beginning and end talking about COVID because we have to.
Yes. Yeah. I wrote a paper a few semesters ago on the radicalization that the nation has undergone and a lot of the first world has undergone. And I actually talked about that because that caliber of, the crunchy granola mom, a big part of their worldview is a distrust of the medical system. So then when COVID hit, their distrust of the medical system supercharged, which then just nudged them that little bit toward alt-right ideology.
Which was, waiting with open arms, right? Definitely. And so in that discussion of COVID, we saw that those expected binaries don't fit. Even, something we push at in the book is that the binary of truth and fiction isn't satisfying. And I don't know where people align politically, and it's weird. I have to preface that before I say it, but there are narratives about COVID and about vaccination that I could stand outside and say, these are accurate. It's like, this is what we should be doing. These things are factual and these are counterfactual. At the same time, no matter how much I say that, it doesn't work rhetorically.
Right.
If it worked, we wouldn't have seen these things. And it seems like typically our response is the double down, where it's like, well, people who don't believe this about vaccination, that it actually works, that we should be doing it, people who don't believe that are just wrong and deluded and dangerous. And you can align with that and say, I agree, and yet standing here and shouting that isn't working.
No, it doesn't help because it's further othering and it makes those people feel more indignant.
Yeah, I mean, it potentially lapses into, as you say, it's like if you're already skeptical of establishment things, someone attacking you because of your idiocy is not going to win you over. And so part of the book is trying to step away and saying, we're sympathetic that probably things like fact exist. There are probably actions we should and shouldn't take. At the same time, as rhetoricians, we can point to things that suggest it's just not working as a communication strategy, which means we have to maybe let go of the binary of truth and lies, the binary of right and left, of Democrat, Republican, and try and find some other way. If these are outcomes we want to achieve, we may have to be a little willing to let go of binaries.
How in the future do you think that you could see this project grow or expand? Do you have any ideas?
Yeah, as you mentioned, for us, it's probably work someone else would do because I don't want to put words in Kate's mouth, but for me, it's like, I've been working on this since I think 2017 was the first chapter of this. And so there are parts that's like I can't even read anymore. It's like just chewing gum that's long lost its flavor. There are still parts, and this is why I think the book works in some ways. There's still parts where it's like, that is interesting, but there's also a lot of it where I'm not even sure I can technically read it. I look at it, but it's just going right by me because I've seen it so many times. So I'm not sure in terms of our engagement with it, how much further we'll take it. But as we've alluded to, there's just so much that could grow outside of just, well, these are things you put in your mouth. And, the work of the rhetoric of science, technology, and medicine, they're doing this, that subfield, looking at how does this relate to our broader narratives of medical care, right? Nutrition and eating is a component of that. But there are broader cultural threads here that preceded us and will succeed us. We see it as contributing to that dialogue, the dialogues of food studies, and hopefully other people can pick up some of these threads, particularly the Gothic framework. That was one thing I think that we were trying to build that could potentially go, it's not just Soylent. I mean, you could just read that and say, well, Soylent is quirky, but I'm never going to drink it, and Juicero doesn't exist anymore. But the messaging of quantification and abstraction is pervasive, and you can apply this kind of rhetorical Gothic lens, this notion of how is it persuading through this appeal to transformation, to destruction. What are the kind of threats, the othering that's embedded in this? You can apply that to lots of different kinds of messages and have insights pop out.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. I wanted to switch gears here just a little bit and move into your professorial pursuits. You at the university here spend most of your time teaching professional writing. And I was wondering how you have seen professional writing as a field grow over the span of your career, because it has really had a big boom in the last couple of years.
This is a great question. I was just talking with a colleague about this, Ian Weaver, who's also in the department, because the way we're getting our arms around this has to do with disciplinary stuff like, well, what does our degree provide? And one thing we've noticed is over the past several years, there's been a kind of diffusion where professional writing has, in some sense, particularly like administratively, the major is there, but it's also diffusing into other fields. So a lot of what we do as professors in professional writing is courses for other disciplines. Like I'm just coming from a course that we teach in partnership with environmental studies, basically. We teach it, but it's their students primarily. And we also have partnerships with business and other units where a lot of what we were doing is working with those students to help focus on their writing in professional and technical and scientific environments. So it's an interesting kind of transitional period for us now where, and this is very much aligned with rhetoric, which is a field of study, but pretty much since its inception has also resisted that. It's, tried to not quarantine itself as a discrete discipline and say what we are is a component of other stuff, probably all other stuff. It wouldn't be, I don't think, appropriate to say everything is rhetoric because then it's kind of meaningless, but everything maybe has a rhetorical dimension. We see that maybe with professional writing in that it's this kind of diffusion into less a discrete subject of study, although it remains coherent, but it's a component of all of these other fields. It's particularly interesting now because of the what seemed like left field emergence of generative AI, where, all people who teach writing are asking, well, what's going to happen now? Is this going to exist? And if so, in what format? Legitimate questions. I don't think it's going to disappear. It's just sort of a question of how do we navigate this new landscape and still achieve what we want to achieve with students, if those are still our remaining pedagogical goals. If they're no longer the case, right? If it's like, well, I no longer want my students to memorize times tables, although they still do that. I have a 9-year-old. If I no longer think it's valuable to students to learn cursive, it's like, well, what's the pedagogical goal that's underpinning that? Is that still a value, or has it become obsolete in some way, or just not a priority? What are our goals, and how can we achieve that now?
There's a Inside Higher Ed article, which I've quoted on this podcast before, called Virtuous Arguments, in which John Duffy proposes that college writing courses represent one of the few places in the academic curriculum where students learn the basics of an argument, provide evidence, and consider alternative points of view. He argues that within college writing courses, we can cultivate a greater capacity for compassion and help improve the dismal state of our country's public discourse. That article that he wrote was published in 2012, I believe. And so here we are over 10 years later, and it feels like our public discourse has only gotten worse in the last decade. As someone who teaches college writing, how do you encourage personal, professional growth in the courses you teach and try to teach students how to talk to each other more civilly?
That's a very good question. I feel it is something that's important, or otherwise, it's like, well, what are we doing, right? And sometimes this emerges. I've seen the argument made that perhaps if there is a degradation of the public sphere, perhaps it has to do with a humanities model of shying away from absolute truths. Right? This is sometimes a common critique that it's like, well, once you say there's no absolute truth, then that means anything goes. And therefore, it gives rise to such a cacophony that it's like, well, people believe conspiracy theories because they were told, well, it's not necessary. And I would say, you cannot draw a line like that, but I would say the charge is fair enough. Yes, we often do shy away from absolute truths because absolute truths demonstrably cause monstrous damage, right? Once you say something is absolutely the case, then everything that's not that is not just different, but wrong and bad. And it needs to have an origin where it's like, according to what? Well, a religious text. Okay, that has caused so much destruction. It's caused a lot of good, but it's also caused so much destruction. And there's no necessarily clear evidence that it's like, well, how do you know, right? Any source of an absolute truth, a text, a feeling, even democracy. Because we can, of course, point to things, you mentioned slavery, where it's like, we thought this was a great idea. Maybe it wasn't, right? Any source of an absolute truth is going to inevitably cause so much damage that it is true. It's the humanities model to interrogate that and say, well, what's its source? What are the effects? What's the ethic you have to adopt in order to be molded on that? I would lean into that charge and say that's our strength, right? And it's one of the reasons why I think a university experience is so valuable. The unfortunate thing is that's still a very privileged experience. But if nothing else, you're probably going to bump into people that are not exactly like you. And you're going to have to work together in some capacity. In our classes, in writing classes that have a kind of rhetorical angle, we compel you to think of arguments that you don't agree with. Right? And this comes from millennia of things like the dissoi logoi, where it's like, I know this is the argument you want to make, but have you considered not just the opposing argument, because even that's limiting. There's not just for and against, but what are all the different orientations that you could make a case for in this scenario, right? If you're encountering other humans,
it breeds empathy. Like you're teaching empathy.
I would hope. And this is a unique environment because it's like, well, you couldn't do that out and about just in the marketplace. It's like, well, do you?
Yeah. I was gonna say, can you though, when you're not having a professor making you do it for a grade?
There is something about you're being compelled to interact with others that gives you even permission to, well, it's like, well, I gotta deal with these other people, right? Where it's, the university environment itself, I think, has a humanizing aspect. As I say, it's unfortunate that it is still fairly elitist in that, but it just operates differently than other educational situations. And I would like to hope that our courses, I can only really speak for ours, we also want you to put your mind in the place of someone else. And ultimately, you're going to make a decision. And maybe I find your decision ethically monstrous. I mean, I'm a person. But if you can at least acknowledge that we share humanity, even if we don't share the same ethical framework, I would like to think that is fairly broadly positive. I have to think that. Otherwise, what am I doing here?
What led you, this is a question that I ask everyone, what led you to pursue a degree in the humanities in the first place?
Maybe like a lot of us, I didn't go in with a clear, occupational goal. I was like, well, I know I want to do this, so I have to take this or whatever. Both my parents have graduate degrees. They're both scientists. And so, there was a tacit assumption of the value of higher education. Neither of them are in academia, but they're both in education. My father's a museum administrator, retired. My mother's a retired high school teacher and adjunct at a community college. So there's sort of tacit, you just grew up with education is valuable. And so that was always there. It's like, well, I assume I'll go to college because it's just what people do. Of course, I didn't realize, well, no. You're lucky to even think that that's the tacit thing that's going to happen. I went to the big state school where I grew up. I'm a big state school kid. I'm a big believer in public education because of that. I mean, all of my institutions are large state institutions. I believe in, sort of the obligation of the civic state to educate the individual. But I didn't really go in with it's like, this is what I want to do, or even like, this is what I'm interested in. And so, like a lot of students, my first few years, I was at the University of Oklahoma, were sort of, what's of interest. It's why kind of the humanities model, the sort of, we want you to take these things just because you 100% don't have your entire life figured out at this juncture.
Yeah, that's actually something that personally drives me crazy about specifically the American view of how your life is supposed to go, because it puts so much pressure on the 17, 18-year-old kid to know what they're going to do for the rest of their life. And especially with colleges being so expensive, you feel that you have to pick a major that is going to get you a good job. And then, there's so many people, maybe not the majority, but many people wind up in careers that they hate for the rest of their lives, and they just feel stuck. And it's a shame, because if you were pushed to just go try things, to have a period in your life, I think that's what your 20s is really for, is go experiment in different careers, go experiment in different places and different with different people, and actually get to know yourself. Because when you're 18, you don't know yourself yet. You just don't. You haven't grown up enough yet, and you have to go have life experiences before you can actually decide how you're going to spend the rest of your life. But then also, that is also a fairy tale, because you don't spend the rest of your life doing the same thing for decades. Like it is a constantly evolving cycle.
That's an excellent point. You mentioned, that the sort of self-knowledge, and I agree with everything you said, that it's like, it is an odd thing to say, yeah, you're 18, pick something, and as you point out, it's like, and please sign on this financial aid form.
You now owe us $40,000.
Exactly. It's like, make a good choice because we're going to want this back. And yes, the sort of issue of self-knowledge, you're right, that is definitely a formative time, but it never goes away, where, the older you get, I'm not sure if it's like you get into new things or you just realize more who you are. And I'm not much of an essentialist where you have a core thing, but we definitely have patterns. And, the more I go along, it's like, these are my patterns.
I think that the essentialism there is a byproduct of capitalism, because capitalism wants us all to be a perfect cog in the machine. So if you have a purpose, that is your purpose, and then that is your function within the big machine.
That's something, and I was talking to my wife about this, where it's like, I feel you start to learn more about what it is that you serve in certain ways. We all serve in certain ways. And it's like, well, do you serve your ambition? And there's nothing wrong with this. Do you serve a love of beauty? Do you serve a love of other people, right? Where it's like, I like people, or even just I like one. I like my child and everyone else. But what is it that you serve that interests you or energizes you? And that can shift. Maybe it's a continual process of revelation, where it's like, I thought it was this, is like that. As I've advanced, and it's no surprise I ended up in the professoriate, it's curiosity and knowledge. And that was my experience as an undergrad. I got to sample a lot of those courses. And there were certainly things like, I really like to snowboard. Maybe I should do something, if not directly related to that, but if I could get a job in the medical profession, I could just move somewhere where there's snow. But it's like, what I was more interested in is like, I like going to school. I like the different things I got to do, the different ideas. Ultimately, I was like, what is the area where I just got to deal with ideas a lot? And that brought me into the humanities and ultimately into English, where I was like, hey, you can look at all of this stuff even within our disciplinary lens. It was a while before I worked my way into rhetoric and technology, because even though my education was in English, most of my work experience was in tech. It was even in my master's program, which was lit focused, I was like doing our web stuff. And I had a professor who said, did you know there's this whole other area? She was our rhet professor. I had one class with her, and she was like, you might be interested in rhetoric. And there's even a subfield in there that looks at tech and rhetoric. And so I ended up applying to Purdue for their program with a paper that I think was about Frankenstein. I was like, well, I'm at a lit program, So in interesting ways, I think like a lot of us, I kind of backed myself into it. And what I was interested in was ideas. And, I went to college and I've never left. It's just like, this is what I'm into. And so I did what I had to do to stay. And the area that allowed me to look at a lot of different things in a lot of different ways was in the humanities.
Yeah, I love the word serve that you used in that answer, because it takes the whole pursuit and it makes it no longer selfish. Because like in our American society, we're told to go get what's yours, get the career that is going to make you the most money, or even if it's not monetary, it's going to make you happy. And by flipping that on its head with the word serve, like you're serving the endeavor, like you're doing the work, but it's not for you. Like it is for you because you reap the benefit because you love it, but you're actually working for the endeavor. And yeah. I really love that. The hope, and because I when I talk to students who are on the cusp of a transition, there is this, as you say, it's like, am I going to end up in a career I hate? And, is there value to that? And there definitely can be, but if you find what it is that you feel is motivating you, it's like, pursue that. I have a weird relationship with happiness because it gets wrapped up as, well, do what makes you happy. But that, again, is just like this weird command where, for one, happiness is a strange goal and historically recent, where it's like, we're not supposed to be happy all the time. No one really before fairly recently is like, that's what you should be. It's like, happy was an occasional thing, right? But there was this affiliation with like, but what are you then producing? Even if it's like a religious vocation where I am offering up prayer mostly. It's like, well, what if that God doesn't exist? Is that worthless? I don't think so. Because you are serving something beyond the self that is valuable. It's like, I am doing something that, as you say, it is me, but it is also beyond the me. Yeah, it's you as part of the society. It's no longer looking at yourself as a singular entity, but looking at yourself as part of the community. But not in the same way as being the cog in the machine, like I said earlier. It's definitely more, I would say, socially and egocentrically productive. What gives you hope right now for the future of the humanities? Because we're battling this war of irrelevance, and universities across the country are shutting down their English departments and getting rid of they're trimming the fat, so to speak. What makes you an optimist?
I don't have a huge reservoir of small h humanity, perhaps, in that, we are in historically unusual times. It's true that, you can kind of oscillate between, but things are always bad. It wasn't that... people who were alive during the civil rights movement. It's true. At the same time, we are in historically unusual times. Like, we're right in the middle of a political campaign where it's not hyperbole to say there's a tension between a more autocratic and more democratic pull in sort of our choices at the federal level without singling out anyone. It's like, there are sort of different models about what government should be doing that are historically unusual. As you point out, things like public education, which I very much believe in, are wrapped up in that. And certainly things, just brass tacks of like, what's English's role in that? There's part of me that is comforted by history in that As a rhetorician, we have the advantage of a whole millennia of time. It's not like, this is nothing new. It's like every time it's relevant. We hear a grand narrative of, well, it bends toward greater justice. Maybe. But it's also like that bend has a lot of like dips and curves. It's not a smooth metal. It's more like a graph that's showing peaks and valleys. And if you happen to live when it's swinging one direction, it's like, that's great, but I'm in the dark ages, for several centuries.
Sometimes the low point on the graph goes for a lot longer than the people living in that moment anticipated it going.
Definitely. So, history does give me some comfort in it. Not that it's like, well, this is all teleological and heading toward the good, because I have no certainty in that, but we persist, right? And there is strength in people have been through similar situations. Rhetoric history is dotted, as is science history, with people who've died for their beliefs, where it's like, Cicero was resisting the formation of empire and was killed for that, right? You can say it's heroic, you could say it's foolish, and yet everything persisted forward. And in the humanities in particular, it feels like there's probably not a huge chance that we'll ever get that bored of examining ourselves. There are other fields that could be made obsolescent just because either, you probably couldn't figure out everything, but it's just like, this isn't a priority anymore, right? Whereas fields in the humanities, are we ever going to exhaust our examination of ourselves? I suspect probably not.
I mean, as long as people are still creating art and creating literature, there will still be humanities departments to dissect that art and that literature. And
just being human, right? It seems like it's a subject where it's difficult to see the vista, the end of it. It's like, well, we sorted that out. Let's dust our hands and move on. So the humanities as a whole, English in particular, will definitely change form as they always have. But I'm hopeful in a few different things. That said, you do have to be pragmatic about what happens and deal with what is there and what is inducing certain things to happen. But I guess if I have hope, it's that the pursuit that's larger than the self seems like it will still be there as far as I can see.
As always, our last question. What is the best book that you've read recently?
Great question. And like any person in English, I cheated this because I was like, well, what you really mean is this and some other things. So right now what I'm reading, and I catalog my media consumption in part because then I can go back and sort of remember. I was like, oh, I remember that semester I was playing Dead Cells obsessively. I was like, yeah, I remember that. So right now I'm reading the book Tomorrow and Tomorrow and Tomorrow.
By Gabriella Zevin?
Yes.
I adore that novel, yes.
I haven't finished.
Oh, no. You shall continue to enjoy it. I thought that book was perfect.
My wife read it before me and she suggested it. And then I started to get recommendations from other quarters. And so I was like, honey, can I borrow that book? And she was like, well, did it take till other people recommended it before? I was like, no, it was just the critical mass is what it was. I took her recommendation, and like all of us, I just have this huge backlog. I have a literal list, which gives me anxiety. I shouldn't do it.
It's even worse when it's physical. I have a stack of books that I'm waiting to get through. Yes. I think it's 14 books tall right now, and I'm in a master's program, so I'm not going to be reading those books anytime soon. Yeah.
I had to stop just for like physical space reasons. I have this piece it's called I've Crammed My Head Full of Garbage that addresses this notion of when you make memory exterior like that, it has implications. Not necessarily bad or good, but it has implications. But anyway, so that was on my list, but it floated to the top because I just kept hearing. And also there were folks in game development who were like, this is an interesting picture in game development, which is relevant to the plot. But it's, I think if you have no comfort with that, I think you could still read it and Absolutely. Be like, this is still great.
The game developing in that novel, while it does, of course, affect the plot, it almost feels like it's more part of the setting.
Yeah, exactly. So I'm reading that right now, and it's reminding me of a couple other works like Grossman's You, which is also about game development. It's different in that sort of the setup for it is the protagonist is going to join this game dev company that was started by one of his childhood friends who has passed away. And so part of it is, it's not exactly a mystery, but like he's not quite certain why he died. And then it's mostly about like reconnecting with that person and some other friends and sort of like their divergent paths. And it has some interesting turns in it. And then Ullman's The Bug, which is an interesting book. And like if you have a background in tech, it's just interesting because a lot of it is about this infuriating software bug that they can't reproduce it consistently. And one of the characters is just driven into madness because it becomes emblematic of other, frustrations. And so to me, this has been a good book that I'm reading right now, and it's connecting to some other things I'm interested in. Just some other things like I'm not a huge fan of ongoing series because I like things to be encapsulated. There is a series I'm reading right now, the Saga series, which is a graphic series, and it's very good. And it's still ongoing, and it frustrates me that I get the trade paperbacks, and I'm like, okay, and now it'll be another. And he took a break of, I think it's like a decade, where he's like, I'm burned out, and I can't do this. I'll come back. And it's like one of those series, like, King Killer, where it's like, I don't think you're ever coming back, or Song of Ice and Fire, where it's like, I don't know, man.
Yeah, I firmly believe that George R. R. Martin is going to die before that book comes out.
I think that's his plan.
Yeah, I think it is.
Like, I think
he's done, but he doesn't want to tell anyone.
So the Saga series, I'm reading Wayward Children, which I think is a good series, and it's ongoing. And then I was reading for the book, the Southern Reach trilogy, Annihilation, and the other two are like Authority, and I can't remember the other one.
Dr. Tirrell, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Of
course.
This has been a lot of fun.
Yeah, for me as well. It's always, you'll take any opportunity to talk about your own work. So.
All right. Well, great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Relevate is produced each week by Audacious Media and the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. Today's episode was hosted, produced, and edited by myself, Daniel Charles Wright, and executive produced by Dr. Megan Sweeney. Special thanks to Randall Library and the excellent people of the Digital Makerspace for lending us their studio. If you have a project, a paper, or a topic that you'd like to discuss on the podcast, and you're a faculty member or a student of an accredited college or university, please send us an email at relevatepod@gmail.com. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.